It was a Tuesday morning, and the sky outside the station was a dull gray. The kind of day that starts slow, with paperwork piling up and coffee cups drained before noon. I was about halfway through my shift and the radio crackled with a call that would change the course of the day. Unit 5-2, we have a report of a potential suicide attempt. Caller states a male is threatening to hang himself. Location is 224, Birch Street, apartment 3B. My heart sank as I listened. The weight of those calls hits different. You can handle drug busts, theft, even assault, but when someone's life is on the line in a situation like this, every second feels like an hour. I grabbed my jacket, signaling to my partner, Officer Sarah Martinez, and we raced out the door. We didn't have time to waste. As we sped through traffic, lights flashing and sirens wailing, dispatch filled us in on the details. The caller was a neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, who overheard the man's desperate cries through the thin apartment walls. His name was Daniel Harris, 28 years old, and from what Mrs. Henderson could gather, he had recently broken up with his girlfriend. Apparently, she had moved out just a few days prior, and since then, things had taken a dark turn for Daniel. He's been talking about not being able to go on, officer, Mrs. Henderson had said. I tried knocking, but he won't answer. I'm scared for him. Sarah shot me a worried glance as she sped down Birch Street. We've got to get there in time, James, she said. I nodded, feeling that familiar knot tighten in my gut. We will. When we arrived at 224, Birch Street, Mrs. Henderson was waiting outside the building, her hands trembling as she wrung a dish towel nervously. She pointed us upstairs. I heard him crying just a few minutes ago. Please, you've got to help him. We bounded up the stairs, skipping two at a time, our boots echoing through the narrow hallway. Apartment 3B. The door was locked, of course, and the blinds were drawn over the windows. No noise came from inside. I knocked, loudly but firm. Daniel. This is Officer James. We're here to help. Please, open the door. No answer. Sarah tried, too, knocking a little softer. Daniel, we're here because people care about you. We just want to talk. Still nothing. Then, faintly, we heard it. A sound, like something scraping against the floor. My heart raced. We're going in, I muttered to Sarah. With a swift kick, the door gave way, and we rushed inside. The apartment was dark, save for a sliver of daylight leaking through the edges of the drawn blinds. The air was thick, musty, like no one had opened a window in days. I scanned the room quickly, living room to the left, small kitchen straight ahead, and a narrow hallway leading to what I assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. But the place was eerily quiet. Sarah and I exchanged a look, both of us on high alert. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that coils tight around your chest and doesn't let go. We moved in, slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle him if he was still conscious, but also knowing that time was slipping away with every second that passed. Daniel? I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. It's Officer James. We're here to help. Nothing. Just that heavy, oppressive quiet. Sarah was already checking the living room, her flashlight sweeping over the scattered furniture, an overturned coffee table, a couch with cushions half on the floor, and a TV screen that looked like it had been smashed, cracked spiderwebbing across the surface. This place had seen some violence, and recently. My gut told me we were running out of time. As I moved down the hallway, the scraping sound came again, louder this time. My pulse quickened. It was coming from the bedroom. I motioned for Sarah to follow. We reached the door, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see a shadow moving inside. Slowly, I pushed it open. There he was. Daniel Harris was standing on a chair, a rope tied to the ceiling fan and looped around his neck. His face was red, sweat streaming down his temples. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold on to the rope, but he was trying to secure it, his breathing erratic and shallow. "Daniel!" I yelled, stepping forward. "Stop! Don't do this!" He froze for a second, his wide, panicked eyes locking onto mine. But it was like he was in a trance, too far gone in his own despair to register our presence fully. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. "It's too late. I can't fix this." "No, it's not too late," Sarah said gently, stepping beside me. "Whatever's happened, it can be fixed. You don't have to do this." His hands trembled, the chair wobbling slightly beneath him. One wrong move, and that rope would tighten. My heart was pounding in my ears as I calculated the distance between us. I had to be smart about this, too aggressive, and he might panic, too slow, and we'd lose him. "Daniel, listen to me," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "You're not alone. We're here. Whatever's going on, it's not worth your life." He blinked, a tear slipping down his cheek. "She's gone," he whispered, his voice broken. "There's nothing left. She's gone, and I'm nothing." "People leave, Daniel," I said, taking a cautious step forward. "I know it feels like the end of the world right now, but this isn't the answer. There's still hope. You just have to give yourself a chance to see it." He wavered, his fingers loosening on the rope for a split second. That was all I needed. With one swift motion, I lunged forward, grabbing him around the waist and pulling him off the chair. The force knocked us both to the floor, the rope snapping loose from the ceiling fan as we crashed onto the hardwood. I felt the impact in my knees and elbows, but I didn't care. I had him. He was alive. Sarah was beside us in an instant, helping to untangle the rope from around his neck. Daniel lay there, gasping, tears streaming down his face as the reality of what had almost happened sunk in. He didn't resist, didn't fight us. Instead, he broke down, sobbing into his hands. "It's okay, Daniel," Sarah whispered, her hand on his shoulder. "You're going to be okay." I knelt beside him, my breath still coming in heavy bursts, and felt that knot in my stomach finally begin to loosen. We had gotten to him in time. This time, we'd won. But as we sat there, the weight of the moment settling in, I couldn't shake the thought that there was more to this. Something didn't feel right. The smashed TV, the overturned furniture, this wasn't just the result of a breakup. There was something darker lurking beneath the surface. I exchanged a glance with Sarah, and I could tell she was thinking the same thing. We had saved Daniel's life today, but this was far from over. Something had driven him to this point. And I had a feeling we were about to find out exactly what. After a few minutes, Daniel's sobbing quieted, but he was still trembling, curled up on the floor with his back against the wall. Sarah stayed close, her voice soft, offering him words of reassurance. I gave her a nod. She had a way of connecting with people in their worst moments, and right now, Daniel needed that more than anything. I stood up, scanning the room. Something felt off, like a shadow lurking just beyond what we could see. I couldn't shake the tension in my gut. The apartment was more than just messy, it was trashed. The broken TV screen, the shattered lamp in the corner, the torn-up couch cushions. This wasn't just a man losing control for a few hours after a breakup. It looked like a fight had gone down in here, and I couldn't help but wonder if Daniel had been on the receiving end of it. I walked over to the coffee table, which was tipped on its side, pieces of a broken picture frame scattered across the floor. I bent down and picked up the photo inside, brushing the glass away. It was Daniel and a woman, smiling at what looked like a party, drinks in their hands. She had long blonde hair, and he was looking at her like she was the center of his universe. His ex-girlfriend, no doubt. Sarah glanced up at me, catching the picture in my hand. "That's her?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Must be." Daniel looked up from the floor, his eyes red and swollen. He saw the picture in my hand and winced like he'd been punched in the gut. I loved her, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I thought we were going to get married, start a life together. I crouched down, holding the photo where he could see it. What happened, Daniel? His eyes dropped to the floor again. He didn't answer right away, but I could see the battle raging inside him. Part of him wanted to let it out, to say everything, but another part of him, maybe the part that still felt like there was something to lose, kept holding back. She left, he finally said, his voice breaking. 2 days ago. Packed her bags, told me she couldn't do it anymore. I tried to make her stay, I begged her, but she wouldn't listen. I don't know what I did wrong. I watched him closely, trying to read between the lines. This wasn't just about a breakup. Did she say why? He swallowed hard. She said I was too controlling. That I never gave her any space, that I smothered her. But I wasn't trying to. He stopped, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. I just loved her. I wanted her to be safe. Sarah was still next to him, her voice calm and steady. Safe from what, Daniel? He blinked, like the question had caught him off guard. From everything. I mean, this world is dangerous, you know. People get hurt all the time. I didn't want anything to happen to her. I could see where this was going. Daniel wasn't just heartbroken, he was obsessed. His need to protect had crossed a line, and I had a feeling it had pushed his girlfriend away more than he realized. Did you two have a fight the night she left? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. She tried to walk out, and I grabbed her arm. I didn't mean to hurt her, but she looked at me like I was a monster. His voice cracked again. She told me it was over for good. I shared a look with Sarah. We'd seen this before, relationships where love blurred into control, where protection became possession. But there was still more we didn't know. Did she leave on her own? I asked. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than I intended. Daniel's eyes flickered with something, a flash of guilt, or maybe fear. Of course she did, he said quickly, too quickly. I didn't stop her. I studied him, my instincts firing on all cylinders. Something in his story wasn't adding up. If she had left without a struggle, why was the apartment in such a state? And why did I get the feeling that Daniel was hiding something? Mind if we take a look around? I asked, standing up and motioning toward the rest of the apartment. He nodded weakly, not putting up any resistance, which wasn't exactly reassuring. Sarah and I moved through the hallway toward the bedroom, the air thick with the scent of stale sweat and something else, something metallic, like blood, though it was faint. The bedroom door was wide open now, the bed unmade, clothes scattered everywhere. On the nightstand, I spotted a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a prescription bottle lying on its side. But it was what was on the floor that made my stomach tighten. A small, dark stain in the carpet, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Blood. Not much, but enough to set off alarm bells. I pointed it out to Sarah, and she gave a small nod. We need to get forensics in here, she whispered. I agreed. Daniel, I called, my voice firm as I stepped back into the hallway. Is there something you're not telling us? Did something happen after she left? He didn't answer right away. His head was down, his hands clenched tightly into fists, and I could see the panic rising in his eyes. Daniel, I said again, more forcefully this time. If there's something we need to know, now's the time to tell us. Because if something happened to her, we need to find her. Before it's too late. His breathing was shallow, and for a moment, I thought he might bolt. But then he crumpled, his head dropping into his hands. I didn't mean to, he whispered, the words barely audible. I didn't mean to hurt her. Sarah and I exchanged a sharp glance. This was it. The confession, or at least the start of one. I could feel the gravity of the moment sinking in. "What happened, Daniel?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow, like he was already trapped in the consequences of his actions. "She tried to leave that night, but I didn't want her to go. I grabbed her, and she fought back. She hit her head on the table, and she stopped moving. I didn't know what to do. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a suicide call anymore. We had a possible homicide on our hands. Where is she, Daniel?" I asked, my voice low but insistent. His lip trembled as he pointed toward the closet. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest as I moved toward the closet door. I reached out, gripping the handle, and pulled it open. Inside, among the hanging clothes and scattered belongings, was the unmistakable shape of a body, wrapped in a bedsheet. My breath caught in my throat. This had just turned into something far darker than we'd expected. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, the world around me narrowed to just that closet and the horror it held. I couldn't look away from the bundle of fabric, the faint outline of a human form beneath it. The air in the room seemed to thicken, weighed down by the grim reality of what we had just uncovered. Sarah stood beside me, her face pale but controlled. She had seen this before. We both had. But no matter how many times you see it, it never gets easier. I took a breath, steadying myself before I stepped closer. The sheet was twisted around the body, tucked in like someone had tried to hide it in a hurry. The blood Daniel mentioned, a small amount, was now visible along the edge of the sheet, a dark brownish stain that had seeped through the fabric. "Sarah," I said quietly, motioning for her to stay with Daniel while I handled this part. I crouched down, careful not to disturb anything, and slowly, with gloved hands, peeled back the sheet. The face that stared back at me was bruised and swollen, but unmistakably the woman from the photograph, Daniel's girlfriend. Her blonde hair was matted with blood, and there was a nasty gash above her right temple, confirming Daniel's story of her hitting her head during their altercation. She had been dead for at least a couple of days, the body stiff with rigor mortis. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to push back the anger bubbling up inside me. Whatever had happened between them, she didn't deserve this. No one did. I stood up, carefully wrapping the sheet back around her, and turned to Sarah, who was watching me with a look that said everything. We both knew this was going to be bad, worse than we had thought when we first got the call. "We need to call this in," I said quietly. "Get CSU here. We're dealing with a homicide." Sarah gave a small nod, her hand resting on her radio. She spoke into it with the kind of calm that only years of experience could bring. "This is Unit 5-2. We need crime scene and homicide detectives at 224, Birch Street, Apartment 3B. Suspected homicide. Confirmed victim." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Meanwhile, Daniel sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his face in his hands. He wasn't crying anymore, but his body shook with silent tremors, the weight of what he had done finally crashing down on him. I had seen this reaction before, too, the slow, sinking realization that there's no going back. That, whatever the intentions had been, a line had been crossed, and the consequences were inevitable. I crouched down in front of him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Daniel, you need to tell us everything. No more holding back. What happened after she hit her head?" He didn't look at me, his eyes locked on the floor. I tried to wake her up," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. I shook her, but she wouldn't move. I didn't know what to do, so I wrapped her up. I thought maybe I could figure it out later. I couldn't think straight. And after that? I pressed. I was scared, he continued, his voice barely a whisper now. I panicked. I didn't want to hurt her, but she was gone, and I couldn't stop thinking about how it all went wrong. I couldn't handle it. The silence, the apartment, every time I closed my eyes, I saw her lying there. I drank, tried to make the pain go away, but it didn't. And then, he trailed off, his hands trembling again. Then I started thinking about ending it. Sarah, standing behind me, shifted uncomfortably. The situation had spiraled beyond what we'd initially thought, but that didn't change the facts. He had killed her, whether by accident or not. He had left her body in that closet for days, trying to hide from what he'd done. And now, it was our job to make sure justice was served, even if it felt like a hollow victory in a tragedy like this. I could hear sirens approaching in the distance, the backup we'd called for arriving. Soon, this quiet, miserable apartment would be filled with CSU techs, detectives, and the inevitable march of a murder investigation. But right now, it was just us, me, Sarah, and Daniel Harris, a man who had lost control of his life and taken someone else's in the process. I stood up, looking down at him. "Daniel, we're going to have to take you into custody." He didn't resist. Didn't argue. He just nodded weakly, like he had expected it all along. He had no fight left in him. Sarah moved to cuff him, her voice low as she read him his rights. He didn't respond, his head hanging low as she placed the cuffs around his wrists. There was no protest, no denial. He was defeated. As we led him out of the apartment and down the narrow staircase, Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had called in the original report, was still standing outside, wringing her hands nervously. Her eyes widened when she saw Daniel in handcuffs, and I could see the realization dawning on her face: she had heard much more than just a man's cries for help. She had been living next door to a killer. What happened?" she stammered, looking between me and Sarah for answers. "Is she?" I nodded solemnly. "We found his girlfriend. She's dead, ma'am." Her face paled, and she stumbled back a step. "Oh, God. I knew something was wrong, but I never thought," she trailed off, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. It wasn't her fault. She had done the right thing by calling us, but sometimes, no matter how quickly we respond, we're already too late. As we reached the patrol car, Daniel remained silent, staring blankly at the ground. I opened the back door and helped him inside, the weight of his guilt dragging him down. He looked up at me once, his eyes hollow, and I could see the question in his gaze, the one I'd seen 100 times before. How did it come to this? I didn't have an answer. Maybe I never would. Some people reach their breaking point, and for reasons that often defy explanation, they go too far. For Daniel, that moment had come in a fit of anger, jealousy, and loss, and now his life, along with hers, was shattered beyond repair. I closed the door behind him and leaned against the car, the cool October air hitting my face. The street was starting to fill with people, neighbors, curious onlookers, all watching as the scene unfolded. But for me, the noise faded into the background. I was still thinking about the body in the closet, the fight that had gone so wrong, and the man we now had in custody. Sarah walked up beside me, her hands in her pockets. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, but it wasn't a real answer. I was still processing everything. "Yeah. Just trying to wrap my head around it all." She sighed, staring down the street as the first of the detectives arrived, their cars pulling up in front of the building. "We got here in time to save him, but not her." I didn't say anything for a moment, just let the weight of the truth settle over us both. "Yeah," I finally said. "Sometimes, it's like that." We stood there in silence for a while, watching as the investigation began, the flashing lights of the patrol cars casting long shadows across the pavement. The story would unfold piece by piece now: crime scene evidence, witness interviews, Daniel's eventual confession, but for us, the worst part was already over. We had found the body. And now, all that was left was the aftermath. The hours that followed were a blur of protocol and procedure. Crime scene investigators combed through the apartment, bagging evidence, taking photos, and documenting every detail, every bloodstain, every piece of broken glass. The body was carefully removed, zipped into a black bag, and carried down the narrow staircase where a small crowd of onlookers had gathered, murmuring in hushed tones. Mrs. Henderson, pale and shaky, stood near the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. She watched the scene unfold, her dish towel still clutched in her hands, as though she were clinging to it for some kind of stability in the midst of the horror. Daniel was booked at the station, his rights read, his statement taken. He repeated the same story he'd told us in the apartment, the fight, the accident, the panic that had followed. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like he was already a man who had resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him. I spent the rest of the afternoon writing up my report, but my mind kept drifting back to the apartment. It's funny how even after years on the job, certain cases stick with you in ways you don't expect. There's always that one moment that haunts you. Sometimes it's the sight of a body, the look in a suspect's eyes, or the sound of a family member breaking down when you tell them the news. For me, in this case, it was that closet door. The way it creaked open, revealing a secret Daniel had tried so hard to hide. By the time I left the station, the sky was growing dark, and the crisp October air felt colder than it had that morning. Sarah and I hadn't spoken much after we finished processing Daniel. She'd headed home early, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day. I didn't blame her. As I drove home, the image of Daniel's girlfriend, the way she looked when I pulled back that sheet, flashed in my mind over and over again. It's hard to shake that kind of thing. Even when you know it's not your fault, even when you did everything by the book, there's a part of you that can't help but wonder if you could have done more. If you could have stopped it before it got to that point. The apartment was quiet when I got home. I tossed my jacket onto the chair by the door and slumped onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence wash over me. But it didn't bring me any peace. My mind was still racing, still replaying every moment, every decision we'd made. Eventually, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank back onto the couch, hoping it would dull the edges of my thoughts. But the quiet was broken by my phone vibrating on the coffee table. I picked it up, seeing Sarah's name on the screen. "James," she said when I answered, her voice tired but steady. "Got a minute?" "Yeah," I replied, taking a sip of my drink. "What's up?" "Something's been bothering me about Daniel's story," she said. I couldn't shake it, so I went back to the apartment after I left the station. Just wanted to check a few things. I went over his statement again, and, something doesn't add up. I frowned, sitting up straighter. "What do you mean?" "There were signs of a struggle," she said, her voice growing more focused. "More than just him grabbing her arm. The blood pattern near the table, it didn't match with someone falling and hitting their head by accident. There was too much force involved. I talked to the medical examiner, he's still doing the full autopsy, but based on preliminary findings, the head wound was likely from blunt force trauma. It wasn't an accident, James. He hit her. Hard. The realization hit me like a freight train. So, he lied. Yeah, she said quietly. He didn't just panic after an accident. He hit her in a fit of rage, and it killed her. I closed my eyes, feeling a deep, sinking weight in my chest. Daniel had tried to paint himself as a man who'd lost control for just a split second, a tragic mistake. But this was different. He hadn't just lost control. He had struck her in anger, and that blow had ended her life. Jesus, I muttered. I should have seen it. You couldn't have known, Sarah said gently. Not until we had all the facts. But now we do. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. The truth was, no matter how much you prepare yourself, no matter how many cases you work, some people will always find a way to deceive you. Daniel had lied to us, maybe even to himself. He had tried to cover up the truth with a neat little story about a tragic accident, hoping we'd buy it. But the truth always has a way of coming out. So what happens now? I asked, already knowing the answer. He'll be charged with second-degree murder, Sarah said. No doubt about it. The DA's already preparing the case. I let out a long breath, the finality of it settling in. Daniel was going away for a long time. His life, already in ruins, was now spiraling into a dark, inescapable place. And for what? A moment of rage. A brief flash of anger that had stolen 2 lives, his and hers. Thanks for letting me know, I said quietly. Of course, Sarah replied. Try to get some rest, okay? It's been a long day. Yeah, I said, though I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. You too. I hung up the phone and stared at it for a long time, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The job wasn't always like this. Some days, you go home knowing you did something good, something that made a difference. But then there are days like this, days when all you can do is pick up the pieces after something terrible has already happened.